Now let me offer you some observations on the religious imagination of T.S. Eliot. I've been wandering across the land in recent weeks, talking about Eliot and many other things, and at Virginia Polytechnic Institute in southwestern Virginia, where I spoke recently, I found myself invited by the School of Architecture to speak on Eliot. And on arriving there, I found that the study of the wasteland is prescribed for all beginning students in architecture, and they're required to pass an examination on the wasteland. That's a great deal to enliven their imagination as architects. And I had a capacity audience. We had to, so large we had to hold it in a church. And even so, people were standing in the aisles because Eliot is a great name at Virginia Polytechnic. Interesting, at this technical institute, one of the better ones in the country, that Eliot seems to be more celebrated than anywhere else in the academy. Well, more than any other man of letters in this century, T.S. Eliot succeeded in persuading a good many educated and perceptive people that the Christian religion might be regarded as a credible body of dogma. It was not that Eliot fancied that poetry could do duty for religion. Nay, he sternly rebuked that notion in Matthew Arnold, I.A. Richards, and others. But Eliot's religious imagination opened the eyes and comforted the souls of many who had been seeking for images of truth. Eliot's conscience spoke to a multitude of consciences, although not to the masses directly. Let me then commence with a passage from the book by Eliseo Vivas, D.H. Lawrence, The Failure and the Triumph of Art. Vivas there writes, "What the poet gives us is what he brings up from the depths of his creative imagination and the ideal isolation of his perfected form and informed substance. True, the matter the poet works with is the stuff of his experience with life. But if he is an artist, the act of creation adds to his experienced matter to make up a literally new product, the informed substance of his poetry. The addition makes this product more than an imitation or reflection of what exists. It is literally an addition, the manifestation of the freedom of his spirit. The vision the poet offers us has order and splendor, whereas the objects of our vision are incomplete, opaque, vague." And Vivas adds, concerning the work of the poet, in Vivas's words, "We do not see the world reflected in it, we see the world by means of it." It's the poet's imagination that enables us to apprehend the world. Well, just so, we do not see Christian belief reflected in Eliot's poetry. Rather, we perceive Christian dogmas by means of Eliot's poetry, especially in the four quartets. The reason why Eliot's poetry moves us to think deeply on the claims of Christianity, and why, I suppose, the typical pulpit sermon today does not so move us, is that Eliot possessed imagination in the highest degree, dreaming the high dream, and the average preacher, no matter how good a man he may be, is not so endowed with imagination. It seems desirable at this point to state what I mean by this rather vague term, imagination. The first definition in the Old Century Dictionary of 1903 will serve us here. The definition runs as follows: imagination, the act or faculty of forming a mental image of an object, the act or power of presenting to consciousness objects other than those directly and at that time produced by the action of the senses, the act or power of reproducing or recombining remembered images of sense objects, especially the higher form of this power exercised in poetry and art. Well, the same dictionary, which is, I believe, the one that Eliot had available in his youth, the same dictionary distinguishes between two types of imagination, the reproductive and the productive. reproductive imagination, productive imagination. The latter, the productive, being, in the words of the dictionary, the creative imagination which designedly recombines former experiences into new images. Well, it is this latter productive imagination to which Vivas refers in the passage from his book on Lawrence, which I have already quoted. Now, T.S. Eliot possessed both types of imagination almost to perfection, the reproductive type, often to his own unease, the productive type with a power that enabled him to pour new wine into the cobwebby bottles of dogmata. It should be understood, ladies and gentlemen, that when I speak of Eliot's imagination, I do not mean that slippery word intuition, although, of course, in a sense, imagination and intuition overlap. For Eliot was uneasy with the claims for intuition. Although unwilling to expunge the word intuition from the dictionary, Eliot wrote in reply to Middleton Murray that, in Eliot's words, intuition must have its place in a world of discourse. There may be room for intuitions both at the top and the bottom, or the beginning and the end, but that intuition must always be tested and capable of test in a whole of experience in which intellect plays a large part. In short, Eliot did not trust at all in the alleged inner voice kind of intuition. Intuitions must be tested by experience and by reason. For Eliot's creative imagination did not spring from private revelation or prophetic seizure. In large part, his remarkable imagination amounted to what John Henry Newman had called the illative sense, which we may vulgarly term the jigsaw puzzle capabilities of the intellect, a multitude of little evidences falling into place gradually, piecemeal, so that in the end one discovers, in the phrase of both Newman and Eliot, powerful and concurrent reasons for a belief, even though one cannot consciously trace the intricate process by which conviction was brought about. It was no inner voice, no computer-like private conscience, Eliot's imagination. Intuition had a part in that imagination, of course, as it has in the perceptions of every man of genius. A passage in Andre Maurrat's little book, Illusions, may help us here. Maurrat describes the visit of St. John Pearse, whose English translation of whose poems Eliot wrote an introduction to, the visit of St. John Pearse to Albert Einstein at Princeton. The physicist had invited the poet there, both having received Nobel Prizes in the recent past, to ask Peirce a question. How does a poet work? Einstein inquired. How does the idea of a poem come to him? How does this idea grow? St. John Peirce described the vast part played by intuition and the subconscious. Einstein seemed delighted. But it's the same thing for the man of science, Einstein said. The mechanics of discovery are neither logical nor intellectual. It is a sudden illumination, almost a rapture. Later, to be sure, intelligence analyzes and experiments confirm or invalidate the intuition. But initially, there is a great forward leap of the imagination. Here, Einstein uses the two words as almost synonymous, intuition and imagination. And rather interestingly and curiously, Einstein apparently trusted far more in intuitions of that sort than the poet Eliot did. This point itself, Eliot never discussed, at least with me or in any of his books, of his writings. He, of course, intensely disliked being asked questions about his poetry and gave often rather sardonic, although kindly, answers. I think of one occasion when he was lecturing on education at the University of Chicago, a series of lectures sponsored, I believe, by the Committee on Social Thought and later appearing in one of Eliot's later books. And when he finished this particular lecture, there arose a tall graduate student who said, "Now, Mr. Eliot, when you remarked such and such and such, surely you meant," and they went on a great length to explain what Eliot meant. Eliot listened very courteously to him, and when the student had finished, Eliot said, "No," and walked off the platform. And on another occasion, one that's frequently appeared in print, Eliot was asked what he meant by the 3 white leopards under the juniper tree in Ash Wednesday. He said, "Well, you simply reread the line, 3 white leopards lay under a juniper tree." Then he sat down. In short, he said, "You're welcome to make what you like of his poetry and of his prose. It has different meanings for different people. You may be right in detecting something there that the poet himself could not detect or was not aware of." And so it was with these, although he wrote a good deal against the inner voice, the idea of private revelation, he nevertheless never made any close distinction between imagination and intuition, except to generally use the word imagination. Well, as Morat adds in his book Illusions, an intuition by a scientist, in Morat's words, perhaps stems from an unconscious statistical recollection or from the sudden glimpse of an analogy. Similarly, the poets, talented poets' intuitions, this is my own words here, similarly, the talented poets' intuitions may be the work of the reproductive imagination or of the illative sense for the most part, rather than unique and inexplicable glimpses of transcendent reality. Eliot certainly never claimed for himself any powers of a preternatural character, nor even experience of what he called timeless moments, except for a few brief, imperfect glimpses, which he might be called timeless moments. But of course, you and I and the world knows little of such mysteries, we moderns. Some writers on the brain in recent years even suggest that consciousness does not exist, which seems to me a thesis wondrously self-contradictory. However that may be, Eliot's imagination, marvelously powerful though it was, ought not to be confounded with mystical vision or with that inner voice, capital I, capital V, that inner voice which in Sweeney, the average sensual man, in Eliot's words, breathes the eternal message of vanity, fear, and lust. Nevertheless, so piercing was Eliot's imagination that it still transforms men and women who have been born since the poet died. There writes to me a medical student in Oklahoma who, after some kind words about my book on Eliot, declares in his words that Eliot, it seems to me, should comprise the cornerstone of modern literary education, especially for Christians concerned with regaining and preserving a proper worldview. And the medical student goes on to describe his introduction to Eliot's poetry at a conservative evangelical college. There, in the student's words, Eliot was dealt with by having us read the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and excerpts from The Wasteland as examples of disjointed, fragmented, and alienated modern poetry, in contrast, say, to Milton and Donne. By any estimation, he was one of the bad guys, if not a bad guy ringleader. An enigmatic statement to this effect was thrown in as an afterthought. Here he's quoting the lecture given to him by a professor at this institution. Eliot later became a Christian and his poetry became less disjointed, etc., etc. Apparently he never quite redeemed himself in their eyes, the professors there. Well, since then, my correspondent remarks, he has read Eliot with eyes in which the scales have fallen. Even in his college days, this student says, the depth of thought in the love song captivated me in a way that no other modern poet did. As near as I could tell, my professors must either have been unable to understand Eliot because of his Anglo-Catholic brand of Christianity, or unwilling to accept him as a legitimate Christian because of it. The former may have played a role, but since in retrospect I find that I was almost systematically protected, in quotation marks, protected from the wide range of first-class scholarship, I believe the latter reason is the more likely. This was unfortunate, but provincialism is alive and well in the evangelical world. Well, here we have evidence to suggest that Eliot's Christian imagination, influential though it has been over the past half-century, has not penetrated very deeply into the Christian circles commonly called fundamentalist. Yet why wonder at that? For the religious insights so movingly expressed in Eliot's poems have been rejected from a point of view distinctly not fundamentalist by some of Eliot's contemporaries among the poets and by some of his more eminent critics. I suppose that a good many of you present tonight, ladies and gentlemen, happened to see the television film about Eliot produced under the sponsorship of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Several of the poets and critics interviewed in that film wondered condescendingly at Eliot's quaint attachment to the superstitions of the childhood of the race. William Empson was quoted solemnly to the effect that Eliot had possessed, or had been possessed by, a medieval mind believing in hell and damnation. Stephen Spender put in, all these things people in the Middle Ages believed in were very real to Eliot. And a disembodied voice, presumably that of Frank Kermode, declared reproachfully, Eliot believed in elites, he believed in class, and remarked that Eliot's preachy role had been inherited from his Unitarian background. Incidentally, Eliot most certainly believed in classes, but he detested the notion of domination by elites, observing that the doctrine of elites, in Eliot's words, posits an atomic view of society, like that of Hobbes, whom Eliot called that presumptuous little upstart. Some of the gentlemen in that television program seemed to have met Eliot a very long time ago, and not to have wished very much in those dear dead days almost beyond recall to read him with an open mind. For intellectuals whose minds were closed to Eliot from the beginning, because they had been reared on a diet of doctrinaire positivism and scientism, that is a very different thing from an apprehension of scientific theory, for them, Eliot's Christian imagination was a strange and rather unpleasant survival from the Middle Ages. It was not such secular dogmatists, but rather men and women of a skeptical turn of mind, myself among them, who came to learn from Eliot's verses that one is not a fool to suspect the existence of a transcendent realm of being. When a freshman at Michigan State, I first read Murder in the Cathedral. I wrote a long, scathing, presumptuous paper about that drama's absurdities. That was in my salad days. Now my judgment is rather different. For with the passage of the years, certain great writers have helped to alter my convictions in such matters, notably St. Augustine, Dante, Sir Thomas Browne, Samuel Johnson, John Henry Newman, and Thomas Stearns Eliot. Those commentators on the dead Eliot who proclaim that he had one of the finest minds of the 13th century remind me of a textbook in world history for 8th graders that I reviewed once upon a time. In this volume, there were but 2 references to Christianity, the latter of which informed the young. In the Middle Ages, there was a religion called Christianity, which caused the building of many churches. The Christian faith ended then, so far as the textbook was concerned. Well, in truth, Eliot was no medievalist, aside from his love of Dante. The religious writers who moved him were those I named a moment ago, and in addition, the great English divines of the 16th and 17th centuries, and the English religious poets of the Anglican tradition. As for his contemporaries, Christopher Dawson and Martin Darcy seem to me to have been chief among those who influenced his thought. Eliot knew very well the position of his adversaries among men of letters, even though they made little effort to understand his postulates. He was at least as well informed on 19th and 20th century natural science as have been the gentlemen who now sit complacently in judgment upon his intellect. Between him and them, a great gulf was fixed, and it was this. Eliot's imagination could transcend the 20th century, in which he and they found themselves, while their imagination was confined by what Eliot called the provincialism of time. The provincialism of time. No, it was not by any infatuation with the Middle Ages, nor through any abrupt flight of fancy, that T.S. Eliot came to declare himself an Anglo-Catholic. As Huxley Neil Fairchild puts it, in Fairchild's words, one might say that Eliot became a Christian on discovering that he already was one, a very common type of conversion. And Fairchild adds that perhaps the strongest motive of all for Eliot's profession of Christian faith was, in Fairchild's words, his horrified revulsion against the absence of belief in those values, holy living and holy dying, in sanctity, chastity, humility, austerity, from modern society. Well, it would be interesting to me, and I hope to you, ladies and gentlemen, if it were possible tonight to trace the development of the religious imagination of Eliot. We would then examine his visions of hell and Prufrock, Gerontion, the wasteland, and the hollow men. Then we might turn to his images of the purgatorial condition in Ash Wednesday and the family reunion. We would proceed to redemption from fire by fire in 4 quartets, and would trace in those poems his endeavor to express through poetry acceptance of the dogmas of the Apostles' Creed. We would closely examine his imagery that opens minds to ancient insights which positivism ignores. And especially we would try to apprehend his concept of the timeless moment at which temporal and eternal intersect, his awareness that we are now in eternity, and the symbols and images by which he communicates to us this perception. But in the line of another great poet of this 20th century, time runs on, runs on. Let me then turn succinctly to Eliot's own observations on the imagination, the moral imagination, the idyllic imagination, the diabolic imagination. Eliot rejected with contempt the argument of Thomas Hobbes that, in Hobbes's words, imagination is nothing but decaying sense. With Joubert, Eliot held that, in Joubert's words, imagination is the eye of the soul. Imagination is the eye of the soul. To apprehend Eliot on imagination, one turns to his slim book, After Strange Gods, 1933, and especially to the 3rd lecture in that slim book. There Eliot contemns what he calls bluntly the diabolic imagination. You may recall this passage from his 3rd lecture at Charlottesville. He then said, "Here I am concerned with the intrusion of the diabolic," which he italicizes, with the intrusion of the diabolic into modern literature in consequence of the same lamentable state of affairs. He has been discussing separation from tradition. And Eliot continues, "I am afraid that even if you can entertain the notion of a positive power for evil working through human agency, you may still have a very inaccurate notion of what evil is." That's evil with a capital E. "And will find it difficult to believe that it may operate through men of genius of the most excellent character. I doubt whether what I am saying can convey very much to anyone for whom the doctrine of original sin is not a very real and tremendous thing." Now, I suppose that more people may apprehend Eliot's meaning and concur in it in this year of 1988 than understand Eliot on sin and evil in 1933 at the University of Virginia. Eliot's poetry and prose have done more than a little to renew that painful awareness of the adversary and of feeble human nature readily corrupted. What Eliot called, in his words, the fruitful operations of the evil spirit, that's with a capital E and a capital S, the fruitful operations of the evil spirit, these Eliot discerned in Lawrence and Hardy. What then would he say to most popular authors of fiction in our day? Eliot set his face so sternly against the diabolic imagination as given expression by the unregenerate personality because he knew that kind of imagination's abysmal power. The 2 Eliot poems that I find most memorable and convincing are Gerontion and The Hollow Men. Possibly you too, ladies and gentlemen, having reread Gerontion nocturnally, have meditated on what it is to lose beauty in terror, terror in inquisition. Quite possibly with me in imagination, you may have plodded at 5 o'clock in the morning round the prickly pear with the other old guys in the valley of fading stars. That imagery of spiritual annihilation linked to the dogma of original sin does not merely reflect Christian teaching, it renews that terrible truth for the modern age. Eliot struck hard at the diabolic imagination among 20th century men of letters, for he knew the uses of the word to corrupt. As Eliot wrote, I quote directly again, "The number of people in possession of any criteria for discriminating between good and evil is very small. The number of the half-alive hungry for any form of spiritual experience, or what offers itself as spiritual experience, high or low, good or bad, is considerable." And Eliot never forgot the earliest reproof of imagination from Genesis: "The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth." So it is Eliot's images of the infernal that we tend to recall most vividly. Yet he gives us two images drawn from the idyllic picture of the human condition, and quite different images expressing what Edmund Burke called the moral imagination. It was from Irving Babbitt that Eliot learned of the idyllic imagination, most successfully expressed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and bitterly attacked, of course, by Babbitt. This idyllic imagination is the sort of imagination that, ignoring the hard necessities of human existence, would have us surrender to appetites in primitive simplicity. It is the sort of imagination, at second or third hand, which captured the rising generation in many countries during the 1960s, and which still works private and public disorder today. When Eliot assailed Romanticism, of course, he was not flailing such romantics as Samuel Taylor Coleridge or Walter Scott. What Eliot fought was the school of Rousseau, the romantic school of Rousseau, depraved in their fancied Arcadia, under the bamboo tree. As for the moral imagination, some concept of that Eliot acquired through Babbitt, who took the phrase from Burke. For a long time, Eliot and the Criterion crowd were ill at ease with those words, the moral imagination. Alan Tate endeavored to demolish what was called the ethical imagination because he found it bound up with fancies of private inspiration. For that matter, Eliot very rarely mentioned Burke until his later writings, presumably on the assumption that Burke was what Samuel Johnson had called his friend a bottomless Whig. Not until the 1950s does the name of Burke seem to mean very much to Eliot. But after that, Eliot discerns what Burke meant by the moral imagination and frequently quotes and reinforces Burke. For the moral imagination is the power of descrying man, despite his weaknesses and his proclivity to sin, as a moral being meant for eternity. Human beings, after all, are created in the image of God. The moral imagination expresses what Pico della Mirandola called the dignity of man. It was this moral imagination, indeed, that Eliot had been exercising with such skill and persuasive, innovating success ever since Prufrock. This moral imagination offers to us the images of Becket, martyred in the cathedral, and Celia, martyred upon an African anthill. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Eliot's endowment with moral imagination made him, in his words, able to see beneath both beauty and ugliness, to see the boredom and the horror and the glory. Abruptly, in a sensate age, there started up the poetry of Eliot, exciting, alarming, and morally demanding. The rising generation read it. The strangest thing about this new poetry, people learned presently, was that it came to affirm the authority of Christian teaching, which the intellectuals of the 20th century had fancied hopelessly senescent. In the long run, it has been said, great poets shape the culture into which they have been born. This may be less true than it was in Virgil's time or in Dante's, yet surely Eliot will be read in his imagination work upon minds and consciences long after the literary foibles of the 20th century have been well and thoroughly forgotten. Without bravado and without equivocation, Eliot restored religious insights to poetry and restored imaginative power to formulas of faith. We are entering a new dark age, Eliot wrote repeatedly. If that be so, conceivably Eliot may survive in myth, as did Virgil after the collapse of the Latin culture. The human race is governed by its imagination. So wrote the master of the big battalions, Napoleon Bonaparte. T.S. Eliot was not at all Napoleonic. Nevertheless, his imagination was of the kind that gives order to the commonwealth and order to the soul. The images Eliot revealed to us helped to chasten the ragged follies of the time. I have in my memory his image in his later years, when we would meet at the Garrick or the Travelers Club or at some private hotel in Edinburgh. His face and his manner reflected an easy dignity and a Christian resignation. He had suffered a profound personal tribulation, long before, true, but in his phrase, all time is unredeemable. He had spoken for causes that seemed lost, yet after all, there are no gain causes. He was a man eminently sane and nevertheless a man of vision. From Icknack Sweeney to the light invisible, the images he bequeathed to us enliven our own imagination in an era when it seems as if, in Eliot's words from the Rock, men have forgotten all gods except usury, lust, and power. And his communication is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living.